In his final hours, the old cowboy asked everyone to leave the room, everyone except his horse. He leaned close, whispered something no one could hear, and closed his eyes for the last time. But what that faithful horse did the very next morning revealed a secret the old man had carried in silence for 40 years and left an entire town in tears. His name was Silas McGraw. For 40 years, he'd lived alone on a dusty ranch outside Cactus Creek, Texas. The townspeople saw a quiet, hard-working cowboy. They never knew his past. When he died, his whispered secret to his horse forced them to confront a buried truth that would change everything. What drove Silas to carry that secret to his grave? And what did that horse do the next morning that made the whole town weep? The answers begin 40 years earlier, on a night of betrayal and a gunshot that shattered the silence. It was June 12, 1984. Silas McGraw was barely 25, a lanky ranch hand working the double T spread just outside town. He had calloused hands, a quiet laugh, and a loyalty to his best friend that bordered on unshakable. That friend was Tom Calloway, the golden boy of Cactus Creek. Tom was handsome, charming, and engaged to the most beautiful girl in the county, a young woman named Layla DeWitt. Everyone said Tom and Leela were destined for greatness. Silas stood in the wedding party, the best man with a secret he never dared speak aloud. He loved Leela too, but he would never act on it. Loyalty was everything. The night of June 12th changed all of that. A violent storm rolled across the plains, the kind that stampeded cattle and turned dirt roads into rivers. Tom had ridden out to check a broken fence line on the far end of the property. He never came back. When his horse returned to the barn at midnight, saddle empty and flank trembling, Silas knew something was wrong. He grabbed a lantern and rode out into the roaring darkness, calling Tom's name until his voice cracked. What he found in a muddy ravine by the old cottonwood tree shattered his world. Tom was lying face down, a bullet wound in his back. Standing over him, pistol still smoking, was a man Silas recognized immediately, Leela's father, Judge DeWitt. The most powerful man in 3 counties. The judge looked at Silas with cold, calculating eyes and said 6 words that would poison the rest of Silas's life. "You help me bury him, or you're next." Silas's mind raced. Judge DeWitt controlled the law, the banks, everything. No one would believe a penniless ranch hand over the word of a respected judge. Silas looked at Tom's lifeless body, thought of Leela's heartbreak, and made the worst decision of his life. Together, in the hammering rain, they dragged Tom's body to a shallow grave near the ravine. The only witness was Tom's horse, a loyal bay gelding named Red, who stood motionless in the storm, eyes reflecting the lantern light like pools of morning. That horse was an extraordinary animal. Tom had raised Red from a foal, and the bond between them was legendary. Some said Red could find his owner in a pitch-black night, could sense Tom's mood before anyone else. After the burial, Judge DeWitt told Silas to sell the horse, destroy the evidence. But Silas couldn't bring himself to do it. He lied to the judge, claiming the horse was gone, while secretly keeping Red hidden on a remote corner of his own modest property. For 40 years, that secret festered inside him. Tom's disappearance was ruled a runaway case. The judge spun a story that Tom had cold feet about the wedding. Leela mourned, the town moved on, and Silas buried his guilt under decades of silence. But Red remembered. The horse never forgot the scent of that night, the location of that grave, and the silent promise Silas whispered to him 1,000 times. "One day, Red, one day the truth will come out." The horse grew old alongside Silas, their bond forged in shared trauma. And when Silas finally lay on his deathbed, with Red standing nearby, the cowboy knew the hour had come. He leaned close to the horse, and while no human heard the words, the command was simple: Show them. The next morning, after Sealers drew his last breath, Red did something no one expected. The old bay gelding, who had barely moved from his stall in months, suddenly walked out of the barn and headed toward the old Double T range. The townspeople who had gathered to mourn watched in stunned silence as the horse led them across fields and through creeks, straight to the ravine near the cottonwood tree. There, Red stopped and began to paw at the earth, slowly, deliberately, over a patch of ground that had been undisturbed for 4 decades. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone called the sheriff. And as the first shovel bites broke the soil, the weight of 40 years of lies was about to collapse onto Cactus Creek. The shovels bit into the earth, and within minutes, the truth that had been buried for 40 years began to surface. Bone fragments, a tattered leather belt buckle with the initials TC, and finally, a human skull with a small, clean hole in the back. The crowd gasped as Sheriff Danny Walters, a gruff man who'd been a boy when Tom Calloway vanished, knelt beside the grave. He recognized that buckle instantly. Tom Calloway hadn't run away. He'd been murdered, and his body had been hidden right under this town's nose for decades. Word spread faster than wildfire. By noon, the entire town of Cactus Creek had gathered near the old cottonwood. Old men who'd ridden with Tom, grandmothers who'd baked for his wedding, children who'd only known him as a ghost story. Everyone stood in stunned silence. The local news station arrived, then a helicopter from the state capitol. A 40-year-old missing persons case had just become a homicide investigation, and the whole county was watching. Leila DeWitt was 83 now, living in a small cottage on the edge of town, her mind still sharp but her heart guarded by half a century of grief. When Sheriff Walters personally arrived to deliver the news, she didn't cry at first. She just sat down slowly, her trembling fingers tracing the locket she'd worn every day since the night Tom disappeared. Inside was a tiny photograph of him, smile frozen in time. She whispered, "He didn't leave me, I knew it, I always knew it." Then the tears came, and with them, a fury that had been dormant for years. She demanded to see the grave, and nothing the sheriff said could stop her. At the excavation site, Leila stood like a statue as the forensic team carefully lifted the remains. She watched as they documented the bullet hole, the position of the body, the evidence that her father, the man she'd loved, respected, and buried with full honors 15 years ago, was a cold-blooded killer. The realization shattered her. Her father, Judge DeWitt, had murdered her fiancé. Sealers McGraw, the quiet best man she'd barely thought about for decades, had helped cover it up. And the horse, Red, the very animal she remembered Tom riding proudly through town, had finally exposed it all. While the state police secured the scene, Sheriff Walters led a search of Sealers McGraw's small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of the property. The place hadn't been touched since his death. Inside, they found a life frozen in guilt, sparse furniture, dust-covered photographs of Tom, and a locked wooden chest beneath the bed. The lock gave way with a crowbar, and inside lay a worn leather journal and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finds the truth." The journal was a confession. Sealers had written down everything: the storm, the gunshot, the judge's cold eyes, the rain-slicked shovel. He described burying his best friend while his hands shook and his stomach heaved, unable to scream or run. He detailed how Judge DeWitt had controlled his life from that moment on, threatening to kill his aging mother if he ever spoke out. Sealers was trapped, a prisoner of his own silence. But the journal contained something else, something far more explosive: the reason Tom had died that night. Tom had been gathering evidence that Judge DeWitt was embezzling county funds, stealing from schools, from road maintenance, from the very people who looked up to him as a pillar of the community. Tom had planned to deliver the documents to the state attorney general the morning after the storm. he never got the chance. Judge DeWitt didn't just murder Tom because of some personal grudge. He killed him to protect a sprawling criminal empire, and then he buried the truth along with the body. The revelation hit Cactus Creek like a bomb. The citizens weren't just grieving a lost son, they were now staring at the ugly truth that their prosperity, their courthouse, their pretty streets, all of it might have been built on corruption and blood money. The forensic accountant who reviewed the county's old records confirmed it. Funds had been systematically drained for over 2 decades during Judge DeWitt's reign. The numbers were staggering. And when the documents were cross-referenced, it became clear that Tom Calloway was on the verge of blowing the whole scheme wide open. He wasn't just a cowboy, he was a hero who had died trying to save his town. But the dead judge's shadow still loomed. His son, Jackson DeWitt, now sat on the board of the county's largest development corporation. He'd inherited his father's political connections and a fortune built on shady land deals. As the investigation deepened, Jackson DeWitt stormed into the sheriff's office, flanked by high-priced lawyers from the city. He demanded that the journal be dismissed as fiction, that the forensic evidence was contaminated, that his father's legacy be protected. Sheriff Walters refused. The evidence was solid, and the public was watching. Jackson's face hardened, and he uttered a low, venomous threat. "You're unearthing things best left buried. My father did what he had to do to keep this town alive. You keep digging, and you'll destroy everything." That night, Sheriff Walters received a call from a retired deputy who'd worked under Judge DeWitt. The old man's voice trembled as he said, "Sheriff, there's more, a lot more. The judge didn't act alone. There were others who helped cover it up, some still alive. They'll do anything to keep it quiet." Before he could say more, the line went dead. The next morning, the retired deputy was found unconscious in his home, a pillow pressed to his face, an apparent accident, but everyone knew better. The message was clear. The conspiracy was still active and no one was safe. And somewhere in the courthouse basement, locked in a forgotten archive, were files that could name every corrupt official who had prospered from the judge's crimes. The only person who knew where those files were hidden was Jackson DeWitt, and he was about to destroy them for good. Sheriff Walters didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and sprinted to his cruiser, tires kicking up gravel as he sped toward the county courthouse. Jackson DeWitt had a 30-minute head start, and that was 30 minutes too many. The courthouse basement housed archives dating back to the 1950s, musty boxes of financial ledgers, land deeds, and confidential legal correspondence. Walters had no doubt Jackson would torch the entire floor if it meant burying his father's secrets forever. By the time the sheriff screeched into the parking lot, smoke was already curling from a basement window. He radioed for the fire department and kicked in the side door, descending into the haze with a flashlight and a prayer. The archive room was ablaze, flames licking at decades of county history. In the center stood Jackson, a gasoline can in one hand and a lighter in the other, his face twisted with fury and fear. He saw Walters and screamed, "It's over, Sheriff. You'll never find anything. My father built this town, you're nothing without him." Walters lunged forward, tackling Jackson just as a portion of the ceiling collapsed. The heat was unbearable, but he managed to drag the man outside as firefighters arrived. Jackson was arrested not for arson, but for obstruction and evidence tampering. But the files, the ones that could name every corrupt official, were reduced to ash, or so everyone believed. While Jackson sat in a holding cell, something remarkable unfolded at the McGraw Ranch. The bay gelding, Red, who had led the townspeople to Tom's grave, was behaving strangely again. Leela, who had been staying near the property, noticed the horse pawing at a patch of rocky soil behind the barn, not far from the spot where sealers had kept him hidden. She alerted Sheriff Walters. He dismissed it at first, a grieving animal chasing ghosts. But when the horse returned to the same spot 3 days in a row, Walters ordered a dig. Nothing could have prepared them for what lay beneath. Buried in a rusted metal box was a second journal, far more detailed than the first. This one wasn't just Silas's confession, it was Tom Calloway's original investigative notes, saved by Silas on the night of the murder. And it contained names, dates, and transaction records implicating not just Judge DeWitt, but 7 other prominent county officials, a state senator, and 2 highway patrol captains. Tom had documented everything: bribes, land grabs, and even the faked death of a whistleblower who'd been declared dead in a hunting accident. The conspiracy wasn't just local. It reached all the way to the state capitol, and it had killed more people than just Tom. There were at least 3 other suspicious disappearances tied to these men, people who had tried to expose the corruption and paid with their lives. The discovery hit Cactus Creek like a tidal wave. Within days, state investigators descended on the town, opening cold cases and re-examining years of suspicious rulings. The retired deputy who'd been attacked survived, but was placed in protective custody. He began cooperating, spilling secrets he'd kept for 40 years. His testimony revealed that the night Tom died, Judge DeWitt had called a meeting of his inner circle and ordered a complete cover-up. They had manufactured evidence, threatened witnesses, and even paid off a state medical examiner to falsify an autopsy report in a different case. The corruption was systemic, and it had poisoned everything the town believed about its own history. For Leela, the truth was devastating. She'd lost her fiancé, her father, and now her entire childhood narrative was a lie, but she refused to hide. At the town hall meeting, packed with weeping neighbors and angry citizens, she stood and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. "I loved my father," she said, "but love does not excuse murder. It does not excuse the theft of 40 years of truth. Tom died trying to save this town. And now, thanks to an old horse and a cowboy who spent his whole life regretting his silence, we finally know who the heroes are." But not everyone saw it that way. Jackson DeWitt, out on bail, orchestrated a backlash. He hired a public relations team and spread a counter-narrative that Silas McGraw was a dangerous lunatic, that Tom's notes were forgeries, that the horse was just a dumb animal. He organized his father's remaining loyalists, old men with secrets to protect, and they filed a lawsuit to halt the investigation, citing historical defamation. The town split down the middle. Suddenly, neighbors who'd grieved together at the grave site were shouting at each other across Main Street. The tension escalated when someone set fire to the stables where Red was kept. The old horse was rescued, but the message was clear. Even after 40 years, the conspiracy was willing to kill again to stay hidden. And then, on a crisp autumn morning, a forensic team processing the rusted box found something that broke the entire case wide open. Tucked beneath Tom's notes was a sealed letter, addressed not to the public, but to Leela. In it, Tom poured out his heart, his fear that Judge DeWitt would discover his investigation, his hope that he could marry Leela and flee the corruption, his unwavering promise to protect her no matter the cost. The final lines read, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Know that every breath I took was for you, and if I die to expose the truth, then it was worth it." Look for the red ledger in the courthouse cornerstone. It has everything. The red ledger, the courthouse cornerstone. Walters had watched the basement burn, but the cornerstone of the building, the very foundation laid in 1902, had not been touched. He grabbed a sledgehammer and worked through the night, chipping away at the granite block. When he finally cracked it open, inside was a fireproof safe. And within that safe lay the red ledger, a thick leather-bound book filled with Judge DeWitt's own handwriting. Page after page of illegal transactions, memos authorizing violence, and a list of every single person in his network. The old judge had kept a record of his sins, not for justice, but as insurance against his own allies. That ledger would become the centerpiece of the largest corruption trial in state history. And it all started with a horse who never forgot, and a dying cow who finally broke his silence. The red ledger was the key that unlocked everything. Within weeks, state prosecutors convened a grand jury that indicted 23 individuals on charges ranging from embezzlement and bribery to conspiracy to commit murder. Jackson DeWitt, who had tried to burn the truth out of existence, was the first to stand trial. His legal team threw every motion they could at the court, tried to discredit the evidence, even attempted to argue that a dead horse couldn't possibly be a credible witness to history. But the ledger, written in his father's own hand, left no room for doubt. Jackson was found guilty on 12 felony counts and sentenced to life without parole. One by one, his co-conspirators followed him into the courtroom. The retired highway patrol captains, the state senator, the county commissioners who had amassed fortunes while their constituents struggled, all were stripped of their titles and their freedom. Judge DeWitt's grave, once a monument of polished granite, became a symbol of disgrace. Vandals defaced it repeatedly until the family quietly removed it altogether. The town of Cactus Creek, broken and divided, began the slow process of healing. For 40 years, they had lived under a lie, but now the truth was out, raw and undeniable. The local newspaper published a special edition detailing Tom Calloway's heroism, reprinting his original notes alongside photographs of the man who had loved his town enough to die for it. Schools named scholarships after him. The story spread nationally, and Cactus Creek became a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. But the most profound transformation was in Leela. After the trials concluded, she stood at Tom's newly dedicated grave, this time in the town's cemetery, where he finally received a proper burial. The entire county attended. Leela, now fragile but resolute, placed a single white rose on the headstone. She spoke softly, but her words carried across the silent crowd. "You kept your promise, Tom. Even after all these years, you kept your promise." Beside her stood Sheriff Walters, who had seen the case through from the first shovel of dirt to the final gavel. He told a reporter that if it hadn't been for that old horse, the truth might have stayed buried forever. And what of Red, the horse who had carried the weight of a murder on his back for 40 years? After the trials, Red was officially declared a historical asset of the county. A retired veterinarian who had known Sealers took him in, ensuring the old gelding spent his final years in lush pastures, surrounded by children who learned the story of his loyalty. Red lived 2 more years after the truth came out. On the morning he passed, the vet found him lying peacefully beneath the same old cottonwood tree near the ravine, the very spot where he had led the town to Tom's bones. Some said it was coincidence. Others believed it was the horse finally releasing his burden, joining his first owner in a place beyond secrets. And then there was the final revelation, the one that Sealers McGraw had kept even from his own journal. Among his personal effects, carefully folded inside an old tobacco tin, was a photograph nobody had ever seen. It showed Tom and Sealers as young men, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing on a sunny afternoon. On the back, in Sealers' handwriting, were the words, "I'll make it right, brother, I swear." Sealers had spent 40 years living in the shadow of his own guilt, but he had also spent those same 40 years planning for the day when Red would finally lead someone to the truth. He had trained the horse, not just to remember the location of the grave, but to associate the exact words he whispered on his deathbed with a command: "Show them." It was the culmination of decades of whispered practice, a final act of devotion that turned a simple farm animal into an instrument of justice. The townspeople, reflecting on the cowboy they had barely known, realized that Silas wasn't a coward. He was a captive of fear who spent his life preparing for redemption. The secret he carried wasn't just that he had helped bury Tom. It was that he had been the only person alive who knew the location of the ledger, the one piece of evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy. Judge DeWitt had never known about the cornerstone safe. Silas had overheard Tom mention it once, in passing, and had kept that knowledge locked away, waiting for the moment when it could be safely revealed. That moment came when he whispered to his horse, setting in motion a chain of events that would topple a corrupt dynasty. Leela, in her final years, became a fierce advocate for cold case investigations. She traveled the state, sharing her story, reminding people that justice has no expiration date. She died at the age of 87, having outlived both her father's tyranny and her own heartbreak. At her request, she was buried next to Tom. The two of them finally reunited beneath a shared headstone that read, "Truth endures." Cactus Creek, once a town paralyzed by hidden crimes, became a community defined by resilience. A new generation of leaders emerged, committed to transparency and integrity. The old corruption networks were dismantled, replaced by a system where no one person could wield unchecked power. And at the center of the town square, where once stood a statue of Judge DeWitt as a benefactor, now stands a simple bronze sculpture, a horse, head bowed, leading a man toward the truth. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "For Red and Sealers, who refused to let the silence win." The story of the dying old cowboy and his horse traveled far beyond Texas. Documentary filmmakers, writers, and podcasters all tried to capture the essence of what happened. But those who lived through it knew that the magic lay in the unbreakable bond between two creatures who had both known suffering and redemption. A man who was forced to betray his best friend, and a horse who carried the memory of that betrayal across 4 decades, until the time was right to speak. The whispered secret was not a confession of guilt Silas's own. It was a final act of love for the friend he had failed to save. And the town cried not only for the tragedy they uncovered, but for the grace of a truth finally told. What Silas and Red gave this town was more than justice. They gave it a mirror, a chance to look at the comfortable stories it had told itself for 40 years and ask, what else have we buried? How many other truths are waiting in the silence of someone too afraid to speak, or too broken to believe anyone would listen? The story of Cactus Creek is not unique. In every small town, in every family, there are secrets that shape the ground we walk on, invisible histories that wait for one brave act or one loyal friend to bring them into the light. The question is not whether such secrets exist. It is whether we have the courage to face them when they finally surface. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it is never too late for the truth to come home, then don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next incredible true story. Like this video if you believe that even the quietest among us can spark a revolution of conscience. And drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are watching from, and share a moment when you witnessed truth breaking through silence. We read every single one, and your stories inspire us to keep digging. Because the world is full of Silases and Reds, ordinary souls carrying extraordinary burdens, waiting for their moment. And sometimes, all it takes is one whisper to change everything.